Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. And if you're new to my channel, hello, my name is Gabby and welcome. If you've never been here before, never watched any of my videos, have no idea what I do here on my channel, I cover true crime cases and all of the cases that I cover are a little bit older. They're all basically 20 years or older, so if that's something that you might be interested in, maybe go down below, click that subscribe button, and also make sure to turn on the post notifications to be notified every time that I upload. So today I am back with another vintage and vanished case. If you don't know what that is, it is a series on my channel where I cover vintage cases of people who have mysteriously vanished. So the case that I'm going to be covering today is a case that I recently came across. And when I came across this case, I think I stumbled upon it on a Facebook group that I'm a part of that discusses cases of people who have gone missing. And the thing that caught my attention is that a lot of people believe that this child that I'm going to be talking about is the first victim of Ted Bundy. And you may be like, okay, I'm listening, you got my attention. But the thing is that this case took place in 1961. And I was like, wait, what? You know, Ted Bundy, his killings were in the mid to late 70s. How does this fit in? He would have been 14 years old at the time. The more that I looked into it, the more I understood why people consider him a possible suspect, but at the same time, I'm not completely sold on the theory, and you'll get what I mean further along in the video. But this is a very interesting case. It's one that I could not stop researching. As soon as I put my laptop down, about 5 minutes later, it was back on my lap, and I was like, I have more that I need to know. I was on classmates.com, I was on Ancestry, I was kind of Facebook creeping and looking up what people look like in today's time. It had my full attention for days. Let's get into it. This is the unsolved disappearance of Anne Marie Burr. We're going to be starting off this story with not Anne herself, but her parents. Anne's mother was born Beverly Ann Leach, and Beverly was born and had grown up in TACOMA, Washington, where this entire case takes place. Beverly's family owned a grocery store right in TACOMA, and she grew up absolutely loving animals, which is why later on as a mother, she would let her children have, at one time, up to 13 animals. Beverly had a pretty normal upbringing, but there was one thing in particular that was very traumatizing to her, and this had happened when she was 14 years old. Her best friend in the entire world at the time was Japanese, and this friend, the friend's family, and of course hundreds of others in the area of Tacoma of Japanese background were exiled during World War II. This was a time in Beverly's life where she felt alone and helpless in a situation, and she would later feel that exact same way years later when her eldest daughter went missing. Beverly would grow up and go to college, and while in college, she would meet a man named Donald Bernard Burr. Donald was born on December 31st of 1925, also in the state of Washington. The two married in the year 1951, and pretty much their entire first year of marriage was spent logging in the neighboring state of Oregon. Beverly had been living in a cabin owned by her father on Fox Island in Washington, and at this time she was working as a teacher, which was definitely not her first choice as a career, but she made the best of it. Her true passion was to be a journalist. As for Donald, he was a civilian employee at a National Guard base in the area called Camp Murray. Beverly and Donald would ultimately settle down in Beverly's hometown of North Tacoma, Washington. This was Beverly's home, so I'm sure this made her extremely happy. Now, you know those neighborhoods you always hear about in cold cases? The neighborhood where everyone knew each other, it was deemed safe, and there were no past cases of abductions or murders. You know those areas. That was not North Tacoma. This area in Tacoma, it was a tidy little area with good values, but it had been given a quite horrific nickname. North Tacoma was dubbed the kidnapped capital of the West, which is terrifying. Well, the name kind of gives it away, but there was a history of child abductions in this area. There was the kidnapping of John Boatman during the mid-1800s. There was the kidnapping of George Weyerhaeuser on May 24th of 1935. There was also the kidnapping of Charles Madsen on Christmas Eve of 1936, only a year later. The kidnapping and murder of Charles Madsen was actually a case that Beverly remembered from her childhood. She remembered how it affected the community and recalls riding bikes with her friends past his home and pointing it out as the home where the boy had been taken from. Although in this area there had been abductions and murders, people were not terror-stricken. They still tried to live a normal life, but they were cautious. Beverly and Donald had settled in nicely in North Tacoma, and they decided it was time to start a family. On December 14th of 1952, they welcomed their first child, their daughter, who this entire case revolves around, Anne Marie Burr. Their family grew quickly because only 14 months after Anne was born, their second daughter would be, and her name was Julie Burr. Then her little brother Gregory was born, lastly her younger sister Mary. The family stayed living in Tacoma, Washington, which was a city on the banks of Puget Sound, south of Seattle. Its population in the year 1960 was documented at 147,979, so it was definitely one of the largest cities we have discussed here on my channel so far. The Burr family was a loving family. Loving is even an understatement. Donald and Beverly adored their children more than anything in the entire world. They were amazing parents from everything I read. They were a middle-class family and raised their children Catholic. They were quite devoted to their religion, but Beverly in particular would later on have a hard time staying a part of the church after her daughter vanished and she felt ultimately let down by God. Anne was described by her mother as always being the leader of the neighborhood. When all the kids would play, she was always the one leading the group and coming up with all the ideas of what to do or what to play for the day. She was very well liked by all the neighborhood kids and she had a lot of friends. In May of 1961, she had her first Holy Communion, and this was something she was so insanely proud of. She loved visiting her grandmother, she had been learning piano for 2 years, and she was a great artist. Such a great artist that her teachers urged her parents to get Anne formal art training. The day before Anne's disappearance was August 30th of 1961. At this time, Beverly was 33 years old, Donald was 35 years old, Anne was 8, Julie was 7, Gregory, or Greg as they called him, was 5, and Mary was only 3. It was a Wednesday, and it was the Wednesday before Labor Day weekend. This entire week for the family was basically spent getting the children who would be attending school that year ready for the school year. Of course, little Mary, only being 3 years old, would not be starting school yet. Anne was going to be starting 3rd grade, and she was just so excited for this. The children attended school at Grant Elementary School, and this was actually the same school Beverly attended when she was in elementary school. Pretty much that entire day, the children spent it playing with other kids in the neighborhood. Anne had actually been asked by a friend to spend the night at their house that night, but Beverly told Anne no. During summer, it was okay to stay up a little later and spend the night at your friend's house whenever you wanted. But in Beverly's opinion, it was time to buckle down for the upcoming school year. The Burr home sat in the 3000 block of North 14th Street, an adorable little 2-story home. Beverly and Donald had the master room, Anne and Julie shared a room, and Gregory and Mary shared a room. Now, the sleeping arrangements for this night of August 30th were a tad bit different though. The children had previously made a fort in the basement of the home, and Beverly allowed any of the children to sleep one last night of the summer down in the fort. The 2 that wanted to sleep in the fort one last time were the middle children, Julie and Gregory. Anne was just going to sleep in her room. Instead of leaving Mary alone in her room for the night without her brother, it was decided that Mary was going to sleep in Julie's bed in the room with Anne. The children were sent to bed that night around 8 p.m. Beverly and Donald, being the parents, being the adults, stayed up a few more hours, and then around 11 p.m. they decided that it was time for them to head to bed. Beverly was hoping for a good night's sleep because she had been just really exhausted lately from the heat and wasn't sleeping the best because of it. Also, another thing that interfered with her sleeping recently was the fact that she and her husband had been hearing some strange noises coming from outside at night. They didn't know if they were always just really tired and imagining things, or if it was actually someone or something outside, but every time they checked it out, they never saw anything to prove their suspicions. They hoped that maybe it was just an animal and not an actual person lurking around the property. Come to find out though, Beverly and Donald were not the only ones thinking something was going on, because 3 neighbors would go on to tell police they saw a peeping Tom in their window, but unfortunately none of them had seen this person well enough to give a good description of the individual to authorities. Beverly and Donald locked up the house. The only thing they didn't lock up was the window in the living room. And they really couldn't, because the wires from the TV went through the open window and up to the TV's antenna on the roof of the home. So they couldn't really shut the window completely. The window was always left open just a smidge, but if you were out on the street, you wouldn't have really been able to tell that the window was cracked unless you were right up on it. They put Anne's black Cocker Spaniel dog, whose name was Barney, on the little porch area between the kitchen and the back door, and finally they chain locked the front door of the home. Beverly and Dawn then headed to bed. August 30th into August 31st was not a dry and calm night for the area of North Tacoma though. A huge storm rolled through the area. Half an inch of rain, thunder, lightning, and damaging winds. The storm was strong enough to even knock the power out in many of the homes in the area. Families waking up to complete darkness in the middle of the night. The family did hear Barney barking during the night, but they all thought it was just due to him being frightened by the storm, because a lot of dogs are scared of storms. Sometime during the night, Beverly is unsure what time this was because she didn't check the clock, and woke her up to tell her that Mary was crying. Little Mary had recently hurt her arm and it was in a cast, so sleeping was definitely not the most comfortable for the toddler. Her arm was hurting and the cast was itching, so sometimes she would wake up during the night and she would cry. Beverly consoled her daughter, made sure she was doing a little better, and then sent Anne and Mary back to bed. Hours later, at about 5:30 a.m. is when Beverly's worst nightmare would become a reality. Mary showed back up beside her mother's bed crying and saying that her arm cast was uncomfortable and very itchy. Beverly once again consoled her daughter and then brought her back to the bedroom that she was sharing with Anne that night. When Beverly arrived back in the bedroom, Anne was gone. Beverly and Donald's room was on the main floor, and the children's rooms were upstairs on the second floor. She walked down to the basement in her robe to see if Anne was with Greg or Julie maybe during the night. She was kind of annoyed that her little sister was crying, and maybe she went all the way down to the basement to sleep with her other siblings. Beverly peeked inside the fort, and both of them, Greg and Julie, were sound asleep. Anne was not in the basement. Where was Anne? Beverly quickly searched around the house. Anne was absolutely nowhere inside the family home, and no one had seen her that morning. None of the kids knew where she was. While looking around the home, she quickly realized that things were a bit off. Things were not in complete disarray, but the front door of the home, the one that she had chain locked, was left ajar. The window that was always left a little cracked was wide open, and a stool from the garden was left under the open window. Grass from outside, wet grass, was also found inside of the home. Beverly would later say that as soon as she saw that window wide open, she knew she would never see her daughter again, and she knew she would never find out what happened to her. Which, it's a little drastic to say that, but you can't doubt a mother's intuition. Still in her robe, she ran to the next door neighbors to see if Anne was at any of their homes. She wasn't. No one had seen her. Beverly rushed back home to wake up her husband and tell him that Anne was missing. They immediately phoned the authorities, and this would be the start of an enormous investigation and a case that would go down in Washington history. Since police were notified so early about the disappearance, Anne's case was featured in that day's Tacoma News Tribune. The front page of the paper was all about the storm taking place the night before, but there was a smaller section dedicated to spreading the word about the missing child. At about 6:45 in the morning, roughly an hour and 15 minutes after the discovery was made, Detective Tony Zatkovich and Detective Ted Strand arrived at the family's home. These are two very important people in this case. They began questioning Anne's parents and siblings, and Donald's brother, who showed up to help in the search. Law enforcement started searching the home for any clues that would point to what happened to Anne. They did notice that right beside the open window was a table of delicate figurines, and strangely, not one of the figurines had been knocked over. The person must have climbed through the window very carefully. They would end up finding a footprint though. This footprint is a bit of the only evidence that was found. It was an exceptionally faint footprint because you have to think that it was raining the night before, so it's hard to really see the full outline of the footprint. This footprint though was determined to come from a kid's shoe that was either a size 6 or 7. It was guessed to belong to that of a teenager or small man. They also came across a single red thread that had been snagged on a brick right under the window that was used by the intruder to enter the home. Nothing other than Anne had been taken from the home though. Anne would have only had on underwear, her blue nightgown, and her necklace that she always wore. This necklace had an engraved medal of Jesus and the Virgin Mary, a small identification card, and a medal of Saint Christopher. She wore this necklace religiously. She never took it off, even when she slept. One of the first things police decided to do was to wait in the home to see if anyone called for a ransom for the girl. Police stayed down in the basement of the home pretty much all day, just waiting for the phone to ring and someone to ask for a certain amount of money in exchange for Anne. No one ever called that day though. This was not the only thing done on the day Anne was taken though. At this time, a huge search was being conducted. Local authorities, people in the neighborhood, 100 soldiers from Fort Lewis, which is an army post in Tacoma, and 50 National Guardsmen from Camp Murray began looking around the area of North Tacoma, high and low. One ransom call would later come into the residence, not the day that Anne went missing, but this person only asked for $200 from the Burr family, which was of course suspicious. Donald agreed to meet the caller near Wright Park. The detectives on the case knew the second that they heard about this that the ransom call was a complete hoax, and they ended up arresting the man, and it turned out that he had no connection to the case. He just wanted $200. One of the main set of places they started searching was construction sites. Now, at the University of Puget Sound, which was located a couple blocks from the Burr's home, there was a bit of construction going on. There were a total of 7 buildings being renovated at the time. I'm pretty sure you all are well aware of what construction sites look like. Dirt everywhere, building materials lying around, ditches. They're dangerous places to walk around if you're not experienced in the field of construction. But they're also, unfortunately, areas where some people find fitting to dump bodies. They wouldn't end up finding anything at these sites in relation to Anne, but there was one thing that did stick out to the men there searching that day. There was bizarrely a lone teenager at one of the sites, just there, standing by himself, kicking dirt. And the men searching stated that this teenager had an eerie look on his face, like a smirk. He was like smiling. When the teenager looked down and was like kicking dirt, Donald yelled over to him and the teenager just glanced up. Police were urged to search the campus because of this. They did a little bit, but not a lot, and nothing was really found, and this teenager wasn't really questioned intensely, but Donald never forgot this incident. The teenager looked almost like he knew something they didn't, but nothing ever came of this encounter, and I'll bring it up later on because it kind of has to do with the Ted Bundy thing. They looked everywhere they could think of, and by about 11 p.m. that night, around 75 square blocks around the family home had been searched. She was nowhere to be found, and no one was really saying they saw anything. I mean, the main individual who would have actually had information or saw anything was little Mary Burr, and she was only 3 years old at the time. It was very difficult to get her to answer any questions. She was just so young. Search teams had searched up and down the streets of North Tacoma, in people's yards, in wooded areas, in stores, and they found nothing. They decided to hire a dive team to search Commencement Bay, which is a bay that Tacoma is located on. Nothing turned up from the bay though. The next day's Tacoma News Tribune would cover the case again, and this time in more detail than the day before. The header of the article being, "Girl, 8, vanishes from home. Chief Hager calls for wide hunt." They truly looked everywhere you could think of, in alleyways, fields, abandoned buildings, even dumpsters. It truly did not seem like Anne was in that area still, or if she was hidden or buried somewhere. Donald Burr really had a feeling about the campus ever since seeing that teenager there. He wanted them to focus more on the university. On September 3rd, 4 days after Anne's disappearance, authorities took his word for it and decided to head back to the campus and search a bit more. By this time, though, all the holes that had been wide open days earlier had been completely filled in. The area where Donald thought his daughter's body may have been tossed was covered back over by a road. Without any proof she could be buried under there, they were not going to be permitted to dig. So this would turn out to be a dead end. Police questioned neighbors, and this was when they got the information about the peeping Tom I mentioned before. And this is when they also learned about something insanely suspicious. Some neighbors stated that on the very morning of Anne's disappearance, they heard screaming coming from outside. They looked outside and saw a car with a California license plate just driving down the street. The screaming was coming from inside of the car, and it just drove off. This seems like a promising lead to authorities, and they wanted to find the owner of this vehicle. They ended up tracking down the owner, and the owner had an explanation for the screaming. The owner stated that the screaming had actually come from the radio, that it wasn't from a person, and definitely was not from the missing girl. This is such a tiny footnote in this case with almost no information about it, but it just seems weird to me. I don't know how much I would have believed that this occurred in the 1960s, and music back then on the radio definitely did not sound like high-pitched screaming, and if the radio was broken or something and making that sound, why would the driver keep it on? This part, it's just odd to me. It doesn't make much sense. I never understood it when I was reading over it, but it's just not a huge part of this case, and they crossed this person off their suspect list. 9 days after Anne's disappearance, on September 8th, Beverly and Donald volunteered to take a polygraph test. They wanted to, of course, clear their names the best that they could from any suspicion. People in the area were kind of questioning at the time if the two were not telling the entire truth about what happened that morning. The two took the polygraph test though, and they passed, which of course polygraph tests are not the best way of telling if someone is being truthful, but other than them passing it, there was really no evidence to point to them having any involvement in their daughter's disappearance. The next day, on September 9th, Anne's grandmother put forth $1,000 as a reward for anyone who came forward with any information that led them to discovering what happened to Anne. According to a newspaper article I came across, Frank Cooper and Rob Hendrickson of the Young Men's Business Club set up an Anne Marie Burr Fund, and many Tacomans began donating. Within no time, people in the area who cared for the case donated money to the fund, and the reward went up to $5,000, which in today's time is almost $50,000. In just the first 12 days of the investigation, over 1,500 people were questioned in relation to her case. I think due to the area's past kidnappings and Charles Matson's case from years back with him being found murdered, they wanted to do everything they could at the very beginning to find this girl. They worked really fast and understood that in a disappearance case, every minute counts. As days went on though, it was really Beverly that lost hope the soonest. She had this gut feeling that no matter what they did, they would never find Anne, and because there was no solid proof that she had actually been abducted, even though in my opinion there was, the FBI was not getting involved firsthand with the case. The FBI was kind of on the sidelines, just overlooking everything, like, okay, you guys are doing a good job, but we're not gonna get involved. As time went on, theories arose, people were looked at as possible suspects, and tips flooded the police department. Exactly 2 months after Anne's disappearance on October 31st, which was Halloween, authorities went and questioned a man who I've mentioned before on my channel named Hugh Byron Morse. You may remember Hugh Byron Morse if you are a viewer of my videos in the case that I covered about Candy Rogers. He was an American serial killer who committed numerous crimes in the 1950s and 1960s, After questioning him, authorities would come to the conclusion that he had no actual involvement in Anne's disappearance. In June of 1962, a tip came in that caught their attention. An employee at a gas station that was located in Manitoba, Canada, an area about 1,400 miles away from Tacoma, told authorities that he saw a little girl come into the station with a man and a woman, and this little girl looked identical to Anne. He said that he didn't think the man and woman were her parents though, because according to him, they spoke a little too sharply, which I don't know what he meant by that, but the employee said that at one point he heard the girl say that she was from Tacoma, Washington. From my knowledge, the couple and the little girl have never been tracked down. There are always false leads called in with cases. Was this one of those? We don't know. One individual that was looked at very soon after Anne's disappearance was someone that was very close to home. There had been a 15-year-old boy who lived 3 doors down from the Burrs, and apparently this teenager had a bit of a crush on Anne. He was 15 years old, some sources say 17, but from my research, pretty sure he was 15. And Anne, of course, she was 8 years old. This boy apparently had a weird fascination with her and had flirted with her a few times before. His family was said to be very religious, but there was just something very off about him, and Beverly picked up on it in no time. I was kind of wondering how Anne and this teenager had any connection at all to start with. Apparently Anne had been friends with his younger sister, and that's kind of how the interactions started. According to true crime author J.T. Townsend, who I've mentioned before on my channel, he spoke to Beverly many years later, and she stated that she still had her suspicions about him, and that he was one that even Detective Tony Zatkovich considered a main suspect at the time. Beverly actually confided in JT and told him that she had a feeling he had something to do with Anne's disappearance very soon after it happened. She said that only 3 days after she was abducted, she went over to this family's home to speak with them. She said that they weren't home at the time and their door was left open. She quickly looked inside to see if Anne was anywhere. Also made sure to look for Anne's necklace around. She didn't find Anne or the necklace. She had, of course, been trespassing, but she was desperate to find her daughter. She didn't find anything of suspicion and became a bit frightened by the fact she was inside their home, and left before getting to the 2nd floor to continue her search. This individual would be questioned by authorities and given a polygraph test. The results came back inconclusive. He failed his first polygraph test, but he passed the next one. The family's lawyer basically told authorities that if they're not going to charge him with anything because they had no solid proof, that they needed to let him go. So of course they did, because the lawyer was technically right. This individual apparently eventually distanced himself from his own family but continued living in Tacoma. He went on to marry, and based on records, he never had an actual run-in with the law. According to author Rebecca Morris, this teenager had spent so much time around Anne that she supposedly referred to him as lover boy, and he referred to her as his girl. This individual's name can be found online, but I am going to be keeping the name private for legal reasons because nothing regarding him has been proven. Suspicions were high when it came to him, but they never had any solid proof, so there was nothing that they could really do. Beverly always tried to keep tabs on him through the years to see, you know, where he was or what he was up to. She just always had a feeling about him, even until her death. Some of the main people around the area, though, that were looked at first were, of course, sex offenders, but all of them checked out and were crossed off the suspect list. This case would be at a standstill for quite a while, but 3 years after Anne's disappearance, there would be another person being looked at by authorities. An auto parts salesman from Spokane named Ralph Everett Larkey abducted a 10-year-old little girl named Gay Lynn Stewart. He took the girl in his Buick convertible and spent a few days driving with her around the Pacific Northwest. Thankfully, he dropped her off after a few days. She was not murdered by this person, but information about what happened during those few days and what he possibly did to her is very limited. But when authorities showed up at his door sometime later, he shot himself with a pistol. so justice was never fully served in Gay's abduction, and they were never able to question him in relation to Anne's abduction. Due to the fact, though, that he had dropped Gay back off, though, most people who look into this case don't lean on the theory of him being the one responsible for Anne's disappearance. Only a year after Gay was taken by Ralph and then later dropped back off, a prison inmate in the state of Oklahoma said that he was involved in Anne's case. He handwrote the Burr family a letter, and in this letter he said that he and a friend of his had been working for some time in Oregon on a farm picking beans. He said that they decided to take a trip up to Tacoma, though, to look for some other work, possibly better work that would pay more. And while there in Tacoma, he said that they abducted Anne. Apparently, he said he and this friend had killed Anne and buried her back at the farm that they had been working on in Oregon. Of course, while reading this letter, the Burr family's hearts just dropped and they immediately gave the letter over to authorities. 2 years later, I'm not sure why it took so long, but authorities flew this individual out to Oregon to the farm he had been working on and said that he buried Anne at. Unfortunately, due to a flood that swept through the area previously, the farm was not quite the same as it was back in 1961. The layout was completely different. They dug up the farm, though, in search for her remains, but they never found anything. And without any proof, again, there was nothing that they could do. Also, from my research, it didn't seem like this individual gave police too much information that only the killer would have known. I swear sometimes people in prison will say that they were involved with a case and tell police that they buried the body somewhere just to get out of prison for the day to go help them search. With a case like this, word spread fast at the beginning of it, and people had a lot of stories to tell, a lot of information to come forward with that they thought maybe had some connection. Like I stated before, there were a lot of odd things going on in that neighborhood already, and people were already on edge. During that week before Labor Day weekend, some neighbors said that they had seen a man walking around the neighborhood, and when asked what he was doing, he would say that he was there to sell cookware. Which, okay, you're there to sell cookware, but the thing is that he never had any cookware on him. If you are out selling anything around a neighborhood, you would always bring samples with you to show off. From my knowledge, this man had never been tracked down and questioned about Anne's disappearance. A theory would also arise in this case that is quite interesting and one to consider. There had been 2 Donald Burrs living in the area of Tacoma. There was Anne's father, Donald B. Burr, and another man named Donald F. Burr. This Donald F. Burr was a very wealthy man. He lived nearby in the Lakewood area. He had actually went through a pretty publicly messy divorce with his ex-wife at the time. Donald F. Burr had a daughter named Deborah, who was not far off in age from Anne. Donald F. Burr's ex-wife was in Europe at the time, and some people speculated that possibly she hired someone to steal her daughter back for her and bring her to Europe, and that the person hired by her went to the wrong Burr home and kidnapped the wrong child. This is a theory in the case, not a huge theory, but one definitely very talked about at the beginning. There isn't much to back it up, though. If someone was hired by Donald F. Burr's ex-wife, that most likely wouldn't have resulted in Anne being gone this long. The loss of Anne and the very few solid updates was something a family should never have to endure. I think her parents really tried to fill a little bit of the gap that Anne left, because in July of 1963, they would end up adopting a baby girl to bring into their home. This baby's name was Laura. It was obvious that they just wanted to bring some new happiness into the family after such a long time of sadness. The family even ended up moving out of their beloved family home 6 years after Anne went missing. It just became too hard for them to keep living in the same house that Anne had been taken from. Even though they moved, they did keep the same phone number, though, just in case Anne would ever call. In the years after Anne's disappearance, Beverly, she really beat herself up over the fact that she didn't try harder to push onto her children the fact that the world it can be a dangerous place. She felt that she taught her children to be trusting of others and respectful, and she just wished that she taught them that there are people in this world that you shouldn't be so unsuspecting of. Well, the next theory, the long-awaited one, I'm sure, that I'm going to dive into, involves a person I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, Ted Bundy. A couple years after Ted Bundy was apprehended in 1978, he became a suspect in this case. The first time that there publicly was a connection made between serial killer Ted Bundy and Anne Marie Burr was in the book The Stranger Beside Me, released by Anne Rule in the year 1980. If you're very familiar with Ted Bundy's case, I'm sure you've heard of this book. The book was written by a former friend of the killer, and there was something that Bundy had said during an interview that really hit her. He was speaking about serial killers in general and their killings, and he said, quote, "When he's 15, it'd be much more mystical, exciting, intense, overwhelming experience than when he's 50. So Bundy was basically saying that committing a murder would be much more riveting for an individual when they're a teenager than when they're middle-aged. Ted Bundy kidnapped, raped, and murdered many girls and young women, but these murders took place in the 70s. He would eventually confess to 30 murders between the years of 1974 to 1978 across multiple states. From what we know, he started these killings as an adult man, but could he have started much earlier, possibly as a teenager like he referenced in that quote? So that makes you think, where was Bundy as a teenager? Well, in the year 1950, Bundy and his mother moved from Philadelphia to Washington, TACOMA, Washington. And he would live there until he was a young adult, and then he moved around a little bit and ended up back in Washington in 1969. At the time of Anne's disappearance in 1961, Bundy was 14 years old, only a few months off from his 15th birthday. A little bit coincidental, I must say myself. Beverly Burr at first thought that maybe Ted Bundy had been involved in her daughter's disappearance, and she kind of thought this on and off through the years. Beverly wrote him on May 30th of 1986, and her letter read, "Dear Ted, on August 31st, 1961, just before school was to start for you and our children, there came a black, rainy night with lots of heavy winds. You were 15 and had been wandering the streets late at night and peeping in windows and taking cars. I feel your first murder was our Anne Marie Burr. The bench from the backyard was used to climb in the living room. The orchard next door was a dark setting for a murder. What did you do with the tiny body? God can forgive you. With all appeals likely to be refused, and soon, there is nothing left for you in this world. There can still be everything good for you in the next. Your life started going wrong somewhere when you were very young. There had to be a lot of bad things happen to make you have your strong feelings of hatred. I came close to ruining my life because of my cruel actions and feeling no sorrow about them. A lot of strange circumstances brought help to me, or I would not have found myself, even though I knew I needed help and my actions were getting out of control. You should have received the same help when you needed it. God can still give the help to you if you can gather together any strength you have left and try to feel a real sorrow inside for the horrors you have brought so many. You will face these horrors alone if there is no chance to be with God after you die. You have nothing more to lose in this world. By explaining your sickness, you will feel sorrow and gain everything in the next life, as God promised you and all of us. Please try. There isn't much time. I am deeply sorry you did not get help when you needed it. I have not written until now because the end of life for you did not seem near until now. Will you write back to me regarding Anne Marie? Signed, Beverly Burr, mother of Anne Marie Burr." Ted Bundy would actually respond to her letter a little over a week later on June 8th. In his letter, he said, "Dear Beverly, thank you for your letter on May 30th. I can certainly understand you doing everything you can to find your daughter. Unfortunately, you have been misled by what can only be called rumors about me. The best thing I can do for you is to correct these rumors, these falsehoods. First and foremost, I do not know what happened to your daughter, Anne Marie. I had nothing to do with her disappearance. You said she disappeared August 31st, 1961. At the time, I was a normal 14-year-old boy. I did not wander the streets late at night. I did not. Before his execution in the year 1989, a Seattle detective named Robert Keppel, who was working on Ann's case, decided to meet with Ted and speak to him about Ann's case in person. Ted's execution was soon, so this was really the time anyone working on Ann's case would be able to ask him about it again. Bundy told Keppel during their interview that there were 3 main categories when it came to a murder that a serial killer hated talking about. These 3 just hit a person differently, even a killer. First one is if the murder was too close to home. Second is if the murder was too close to family. Third is the victim being very young. When you think about it, Anne Marie Burr did fit all of those categories. Could this be why Bundy didn't want to talk about her case much or admit to killing her if he actually did? This was something the detective wondered. During his interview with Keppel, Keppel said, "There's a little girl in Tacoma." Bundy replied, "Which one?" Keppel said, "Anne Marie Burr." And Bundy replied with, "No, absolutely not. And one thing I'd like to do on some of these, I mean, on all of this, if it's possible, and I think it's possible, it's important to me. It's important for credibility because there's so much question about my credibility. You know, I would like to be polygraphed, have a polygraph examination if that can be done in these kinds of things. Do something to enhance the credibility, not just, specifics. I mean, of the specifics, of course, but of my overall account of these things. Because I want it to be believable. I don't want to get into a Henry Lee Lucas kind of deal I have a precious thing going for me now, but what I do have is I've got to build some credibility. As you can tell by that quote, it was all over the place. Now, after 2 letter exchanges with Bundy, Beverly stated that Bundy did say he had no involvement in her daughter's disappearance, but she said that further along in these letters, he would kind of disregard or ignore some of her questions, and he would instead talk about things that had nothing to do with the case, like the Green River murders and world events at the time. As you can see from what I read from his interview with Keppel, he would answer it at first and then just go off on a tangent. It was like it was impossible for Bundy to stay on the same subject. This was something Bundy did very often. I don't think it was just in reference to Anne's case, but I'm sure it was very frustrating for them. There was a lot of talk about how close Ted Bundy actually was in 1961 to the Burr home. There was talk that the Burr home was on his paper route because he was a paper boy, and there was talk that Anne Marie had taken piano lessons right next door to the home of his uncle. Both of these have been disproven. Ted's family home was located on Skyline Drive, about 3 miles away from the Burr home. Their house was not on his paper route. And Anne did take piano lessons, but it wasn't right next door to his uncle's home. A lot of sources in today's time still get this information completely wrong, but it's been disproven. Ted Bundy said himself that his home was located on the other side of town from where the Burr's home was, and he was actually telling the truth about that. When JT Townsend talked directly to Beverly, she said that she never remembered Ted being their paperboy ever. His route was miles away from their home. She didn't really know how this rumor got started. She was also the one that stated that Anne Marie never took piano lessons next to Bundy's uncle's home. She never remembered Bundy around their home at any point. Of course, though, when news about him was released to the public and everything he did, and the fact that he originally came from Tacoma, Washington, she did think that he could have been responsible, but her opinion, it changed over time. She always leaned more towards the 15-year-old neighbor being involved. After seeing a photo of Ted Bundy, though, in the late 70s, even Anne's father questioned his involvement. He even thought that the boy he saw kicking dirt on the campus, smiling eerily, was possibly teenage Ted. Now, could it have possibly actually been Ted that he saw at the university? Or could her poor father be trying very hard to make this narrative fit because he was so desperate to see his daughter's case solved? Ted Bundy's mother, Louise, even said herself that there was no way back at 14 years old that Ted could have done such a thing. Even if he had this evil inside of him, he was far too small at the time. Also, his mother said that in the summer of 1961, she had been pregnant with his younger brother and was actually up all night, so there was no way that he could have snuck out of the home without her being aware of it. Plus, even if he was able to get past her, he shared a bedroom with some of his siblings, so one of them would have definitely noticed him leaving that night. Beverly did tell JT Townsend, though, that she would often see Louise around Tacoma through the years, and Louise always kind of avoided her at all costs. Detective Tony Zatkovich stated that he himself never believed Ted Bundy was involved in Anne's case. He believed it was someone who knew the family. In Anne Rule's book, though, there are a lot of accounts from people who knew Bundy and came forward with information that points to him possibly having involvements in Anne's case. For instance, a so-called former neighbor of the Burrs emailed Anne Burr and said, quote, "Ted was the morning paper boy. That little girl used to follow him around like a puppy. She would have gone with him if he asked her to crawl out of that window." There was also another woman that had emailed Anne Rule, and she told her that back in 9th grade, it would have been while Ted was attending Woodrow Wilson High School, he asked her if she wanted to see where he hid a body. From my knowledge, he didn't give any more information about this body, but over the years, more and more people came forward with information linking Ted and Anne, but of course, it's pretty much all hearsay. It's really impossible to prove any of it true. There are quite a lot of people, though, that believe Anne Marie was possibly his very first victim. And because it was his first murder, because she was so young, because it happened so close to his home, where his family was, that it was the one murder that he would never in a million years have admitted to, even with him being on death row and knowing he was going to be dead soon. The day that Ted Bundy was executed was January 24th of 1989. That entire day, the Burr family kept the radio on just to listen and see if, before he was executed, he admitted to any more murders he committed through the years. They wanted to see if maybe he would possibly also admit to killing Anne, but he never did. Ted Bundy back in the day was said to be a peeping Tom. Ted himself had admitted to drinking copious amounts of alcohol and roaming around Tacoma to look in windows to see if he could catch a glimpse of women undressing. Ted, though, claimed that he never took anyone's life before the age of 27. Some people think that possibly maybe Ted Bundy wasn't the one to have abducted and killed Anne himself, but maybe he knew the person who did, or possibly helped the individual in some way who did it. Do remember that the shoe print outside the Burr home did look like it could have came from a teenager or small man. Could it have come from someone Bundy knew, an older individual who caused trouble in the area and bragged about it later to people in the community like Bundy? That does make sense, but it is just a theory. Now you're probably wondering if any DNA was taken from the home, even though, 1961, they didn't know DNA was even going a thing. There was evidence taken from the Burr's home. DNA evidence, but that DNA evidence is so small that they have never been able to create a concrete DNA profile of it to compare to anyone's DNA. They have never been able to compare the DNA from the home to the DNA of Bundy, so he has never been officially ruled out as having involvement in her case. There was actually an entire book published in the year 2013 all about the connections between Ted Bundy and the disappearance of Anne Marie Burr. The book is called Ted and Anne, The Mystery of a Missing Child and Her Neighbor Ted Bundy, and it was written by author Rebecca Morris, who I mentioned before. In her book, I do have to mention that she claims Ted Bundy actually did confess to abducting and murdering Anne, and that he admitted to all this during an interview while he was in prison, and this interview was with a college professor who was studying serial killers at the time. This alleged confession, though, from my knowledge, was not recorded in any way, so there's not much we can really do with that. Again, it's hearsay. If you know anything about Ted Bundy, he would occasionally speak in third person. Some think that this was his way of distancing himself from the things that he did, the crimes that he committed. Rebecca Morris said, speaking in the third person hypothetically, he basically told the story about a very early crime where he took a young girl out of a house, sexually assaulted her in the orchard next door. Remember, there was an orchard next door to the Burr home. She said that he went on to say that he left her in a very deep ditch. According to Morris, Bundy went on to say that he watched police and her family search and search and search for her. Could this ditch be one of the ditches at the university that was filled in so soon after? According to reports, some of those ditches were about 30 feet deep or so and flooded with water due to the heavy downpour from the storm. Even if this is not a theory you lean towards, it is interesting to hear about the information dug up regarding it and supposed things people came forward with years later. Rebecca Morris did spend a lot of time with Beverly up until her death, and she said that Beverly went back and forth about the connection between Bundy and Anne. Rebecca Morris, though, did say that the best suspect, truly in her opinion, was the 15-year-old neighbor. We just have to remember at the end of the day that there was never a connection made between Ted and Anne until after word of his later crimes hit the media. I could maybe lean more towards the theory if anyone at all had brought up this scrawny teenager named Theodore Robert Bundy lurking around the Burr home, but no one did until the 70s after everything came out. We also have to remember that Ted was 14 years old in 1961, which I'm not saying a 14-year-old could not kill somebody, because they have. He was not driving yet though. He didn't have a car. So if he did go to the Burr's home on his own, it would have either had to have been on a bike or on foot. To walk that 3-mile distance, it would have taken over an hour and in a storm. It is believed Ted Bundy had many more victims, but most individuals are really not fully convinced Anne was one of them. Until solid DNA evidence can prove otherwise, it is still a theory though. Through the years, there were very few developments in Anne's case. Her family tried to have a normal life while also making sure she was never forgotten. In the 1990s, which was over 30 years after her disappearance, Beverly and Donald were reached out to by a psychiatrist. This psychiatrist was located in TACOMA, so right in the same area, and he claimed that he had a patient who was thoroughly convinced that she was their missing daughter. The woman said that she remembered church bells from her childhood. She remembered a canary, and Anne had a canary before, and she also was great at art. Obviously, they had their suspicions and doubts, but they didn't want to just ignore the claim. Beverly decided to invite the woman over. As soon as she saw the woman, she kind of knew it wasn't Anne, but she held hope. They brought this woman to Anne's grandmother's house though, the grandmother that Anne was so close with, and the grandmother, as soon as she saw this woman, she knew that this was 100% not her granddaughter. Poor Beverly and Donald, though, hoped with everything in them that maybe it was possibly her, and they met with this woman quite a few times, about 5 or 6 more times. Their daughter Jolie told them that they needed to do a DNA test to see if this was Anne or not once and for all. A DNA test was conducted, the results came back, and the woman was not Anne. But the sad thing is that Beverly and Donald had this little glimmer of hope for so many years that maybe she was, and they developed this bond with her, and up until Beverly died, Beverly kept a photo of this woman in her wallet. That is so sad. A memorial service was held for Anne in the year 1999. Anne would have been 47 at the time of the memorial, and people gathered to talk about the girl they missed so dearly, shared memories, and discussed all the possible theories that came up through the years. Beverly stated that she knew Anne was no longer alive, and that she was honestly happy she didn't know the details surrounding her murder. According to Associated Press, at the memorial, Beverly said, "I still can't say that she's dead, but I just feel like we've got to do something to remember her because we're not going to be here too much longer." Donald added, "It's something that says that she was here." "Be sure to give your children hugs and say goodnight to them," Donald said, unable to hold off tears, because you never know. You may wonder why they waited so many years for a memorial, and her parents did explain that through the years, every time they planned a memorial, it was like as soon as they started planning one, something new in the case would sort of pop up, and they knew that a memorial was something that kind of finalized her being gone, and they just held hope that every bit of new information would turn into something, but it never did. They knew that she wasn't alive, but even if they found out where her body was, then they could have a proper memorial and not one where they still had so many lingering questions. The two men who spent decades trying to solve her case, Detective Tony Zatkovich and Detective Ted Strand, have since passed away. Strand in the year 1997 and Zatkovich in the year 2004. Zatkovich even said that when he retired from the department, the only case file, and he worked on a lot of cases for years, the only case file that he took with him was Anne's. These two men truly never stopped thinking about her up until their deaths. It was said that they would literally just sit parked in their car, smoking cigarette after cigarette after cigarette, just talking about this case, even after their retirement. Donald Burr passed away on September 4th of 2003 at the age of 77, and his wife Beverly passed away 5 years later on September 13th of 2008 at the age of 80, all of them leaving this earth without ever knowing what happened to Anne. Beverly and Donald stayed together until the end, and they had been married over 50 years. After Donald had passed away, Beverly had actually formed a widows group for other people who have lost their spouses and were grieving. Based on their pages on findagrave.com, Donald was described as being a kind and gentle man who had the gift of making you laugh anytime you met, and Beverly was described as being strong, genuine, and humorous. She even wrote her own obituary. The two of them, until the day they died, never stopped fighting to make sure Anne's case was never truly forgotten, and Anne's siblings continued fighting for that as well. Anne Marie Burr in today's time would be 69 years old, and her case remains an open and active case with the Tacoma Police Department. I'm sure many of you are wondering if there is any more hope in her case besides that tiny bit of DNA evidence they currently cannot create a full DNA profile from. Well, an article was published in 2014 by Fox 13 Seattle, and Detective Gene Miller with the Tacoma Police Department, the lead detective on this investigation in today's time, said the bench that was leaned up against the side of the building subsequently was determined to have a partial palm print on it. There was a shoe print evidence near the point of entry. There was also a small quantity of biological evidence left at the point of entry as well, believed to be at least potentially from the suspect. I researched this case for days and days and days, and when I came across this article from 2014 saying that there was a partial palm print, I was so happy. There have been so many cold cases solved due to just a partial palm print, even some cases solved with a partial fingerprint. So I think there's still hope, even with this case being 6 decades old. So that is the case of Anne Marie Burr, and it is one that I tried so hard to do the best research I could possibly do for it. This is a case that, even if I was not somebody with a YouTube channel that talks about these cases, I would have on my own researched this much into, because I was that, and still right now, interested in it. There is going to be a long list of sources below in the description of this video, that is for sure. Check those out if you want to learn anything else. I feel like I could do an entire separate video of just my thoughts about this case, but I am going to make it very short, what I have to say, because this video is not about me, it's about Anne. But final thoughts. This is the disappearance of a little girl. It is so sad that this little girl lost the entire rest of her life. She was only 8 years old. And I cannot even imagine the pain and frustration and sadness that her poor family felt throughout all of these years. When it comes to theories, of course, the one that is most talked about, the one that grabs your attention, is the one involving Ted Bundy, because he's one of the most well-known serial killers of all time. But I gotta say, me and a large portion of other people that looked into this case really lean towards the neighbor having something to do with it. I know that this was 1961 and things were very different, but for a 15-year-old boy, a teenager, to be saying an 8-year-old is his girl, there's something up with that. I'm not saying 100% he did it. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying he, in my mind, out of all the suspects there are, and all the ones that I've read through, he's the one I look at. But another thing is that if they have this partial palm print, I'm pretty sure they would have compared it to his already. So has he been completely ruled out? I couldn't find that information anywhere online. But if this was somebody that Anne jokingly called lover boy, and maybe she at the time had like a little bit of a schoolgirl crush on him of some sort, and he came into her house, she probably would have went with him. She probably would have trusted him. And also the fact that Beverly seemed to have this really strong mother's intuition. And this was the theory that she herself mostly lean towards. I think doing something like ground penetrating radar around the university would be very smart, but also if some of those ditches were 30 feet deep, could they pick up a body being that far down below the top of the earth? I don't know. There are a lot of companies that work with DNA that is very hard to create DNA profiles from. Companies like Othram and Astria, and I have not read anything about them taking on this case. So maybe there's hope for that. This is a case that I have just been sitting on my own with all of these opinions and thoughts and bits of information about, and I've just wanted to talk to somebody about it, but I haven't had anybody to talk to about it, so I'm really eager to see what you all say in the comments. Leave any of your thoughts, opinions, or theories down below in the comments, and of course there are people still in the Burr family alive today, so make sure to put some love down in the comments as well for them. With all that being said, if you have any cases that you want me to possibly cover on my channel, make sure to send those to gabulosiscaserequests@gmail.com. Do remember that the last 4 months of the year, I have a different theme for every month. I have Solve September, Oldies October, No Trace November, and December, and we got September coming up. So if you have any solved cases, make sure to send those over. And I will see you all in the next one.